We didn't finish school-based practice, and rather than do it in class, I thought I would just do a recording of the rest of the topic. So we already did this, and we talked about the legislation, briefly touched on what do we do, what is the domain, and what is the process in school-based practice. We can work with a variety of clients, whether it be individual children, adolescents. We can work with organizations and entire populations. So you might be working with the school district. You might be working with all of the children within a particular class, if that's the way that the structure of the school is set up. And I think that Stacy talked about a little bit about that, how in her position she's able to do provide direct service a little bit differently. But the idea is that we facilitate participation in various contexts. So when we do our evaluation and when we provide treatment, you're influencing a variety of things. And these are terms from your OT practice framework. So if you're not familiar with them, you want to go back and review them, because this is the structure, literally the domain and process, what it is we can do and how we do it of the profession. So what we do influences the performance skills of the child, their performance patterns, contexts and environments, their activity demands, and client factors. So go back and review those if you are not clear on what those are. So remember I said for special education, a child has to have a diagnosis. And there are very specific diagnoses that are covered under special education. You'll see different lists. This list has 10. You'll see some lists, sometimes they have 8. That's because they categorize some of the other ones together in some of the categories that they use, or some of the lists that you'll see. But in general, these are the eligible diagnoses for which a child can receive special education services, and an IEP may be developed. IEP being an individualized education program or individualized education plan. We'll talk about that a little bit more soon. So an intellectual impairment, a hearing impairment, speech language impairment, visual impairment, emotional disturbance, orthopedic impairment, autism, TBI, other health impairment, and specific learning disabilities. Now, you'll see there's kind of very specific diagnoses and a rather vague diagnoses. And that's how some children are able to get services, is they are classified as having an other health impairment. So it's kind of a catch-all category for when a child, there's a sense that a child needs to have services, requires specialized instruction. So sometimes things like a global developmental delay might fall into that category. So what do? We are a related service, and that is under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So occupational therapy is considered a related service, and we are considered related service providers. And what we do is we identify the academic, the developmental, and the functional needs of the child. What are the child's strengths, and what are the things that are interfering with the child's participation? We also look at the context of the learning activities, the routines, and the environment. So it's all of those factors can play a role in a child's ability to be successful within an academic setting. It's really important that we observe the child in the context, because the different contexts, the child will behave differently, and you'll see different challenges. A child may perform well in the classroom, but then go into the cafeteria and be in sensory overload, or do well on the playground, but not so much in the classroom. So you want to the extent possible, observe that child in the various contexts in which that child has to perform. It's also important to compare that child's performance to the other children in the same environment and situation. And also, what are the demands of the curriculum and the task, as well as what environmental modifications might be appropriate. So when we conduct an evaluation, you want to do interviews. To the extent possible, I talk to the child. I like to talk to the parents too and see what kind of challenges and what what goals that the parents might have for their child. So how is that child's behavior at home? What are the goals that the parents have for that child, etc. You want to look at what services the child is currently getting. You want to look at the potential need for assistive technology. Many of schools have an assistive technology team, and when it's deemed appropriate, they might deploy that team to do an evaluation of the child to see what role that assistive technology may play for this child. I advocate for an OT always being part of that team. It doesn't always work out that way. I don't understand why it doesn't, but that is a role that I would suggest you advocate for if you are in this setting. When appropriate, do standardized testing. Many districts require standardized testing to be done because they'll base the eligibility for services on the results of that standardized testing. Then the results are shared at a team meeting, and the entire team is comprised of all of the professionals. So when you heard Stacy talking about a PPT team, in general, that there are different acronyms and there are different names for what that team is in different districts. But in general, it's an IEP team or it's an educational team. And it's comprised of all of the relevant people within that child's academic life. So oftentimes it's going to be a principal of the school, a special education teacher sometimes there, not always. The general education teacher is there. The parent is part of that team. The other service providers or related service providers who conducted evaluations are likely going to be there. The OT, the PT, speech language pathologist, the psychologist. So there's also a team, they call them a team chair, or they have different names for the role that the person plays, but it's kind of the coordinator, the person who will develop the IEP based on the input of everyone will also be present. So it's a variety of people. The parent needs to be there. So if the meeting is scheduled at a time that is inconvenient for the parents, then it should be rescheduled. The parents are also by law supposed to get copies of any reports that are done. So when you do your evaluation and you write up a report, the parent is supposed to get those reports at least 2 days before the meeting. That doesn't happen in my experience as often as it should. A lot of times therapists and service providers will give the parents the evaluation right there in the meeting. And that's really not fair to the parents. They should have the opportunity to read that document, try to digest the information that's there, and be able to come to the meeting to ask specific questions to those service providers. So by law, they are supposed to get that report at least 2 days before the meeting, and it is supposed to be in their native language. And that's another one of those challenges that we experience in practice quite a lot is, does the district have an interpreter who can translate that report for them or be able to translate it in written form and be able to provide it to the parent. So those are aspects of the law. Those are aspects of the law that don't always get followed, but they should. As part of that process, the individualized education program / plan is developed, and that includes the goals for the child, and they are always child's goals. It's not what the therapist will do or what the teacher will do, but what we want the child to be able to achieve. And we're going to get to that next semester, but just keep that in mind. It also includes whatever accommodations they might need, what services they're going to receive, the supports. Sometimes it's going to involve the placement. Where's the child going to be educated? Also, remember we talked about the push-in versus pull-out services. So you have to specify where the services are going to occur. If it's going to be a pull-out model, you have to be able to justify that. So OTs are part of this collaborative team. And if OT is warranted, now the team decides if OT is warranted, not the OT. It's the professional. Typically, the team will go with the professional judgment of the OT, but it is the team decision. And the team decides whether the related service is necessary, how much time it will be, how frequently the services will occur, and the location of the services. So those are all things that are discussed within this team meeting. The team meets regularly to review the progress. They have to meet and revise the IEP every year. And the child is reevaluated after 3 years if they continue to be on service. And it's not unusual for a child to be able to be on services for much more than the 3 years. It is a collaborative process, and it happens in the natural environment. And it's important to be respectful of the customs, beliefs, and behaviors of the child and the family. So just some examples. If there is a child has difficulty with academic performance, you as the OT might consult with people developing the curriculum to identify any modifications or accommodations that might be necessary for things like standardized testing. You may suggest adaptations to the materials, how the teaching occurs, what the process is, what the child is expected to produce. And you might work to provide transition services and supports, and that happens. Transitions occur when a child switches schools, but also most importantly when they are about to age out of the school setting. If the difficulty is in the developmental performance, you might do things to foster the development of those academic skills, such as pre-writing and pre-scissor skills, could be toileting skills, could be eating and drinking, could be dressing and grooming, communication skills, and social skills. We'll talk about some of those categories in a little bit. If the difficulty is their functional performance, you might help them be able to manage their materials, follow their routines, develop a schedule, complete written work. So you get the idea. So the outcomes that we're looking for are measured by the achievement on those goals and other educational objectives. So when we develop an IEP, we develop both long-term goals and short-term goals. However, what gets confusing, and we'll go into this in more detail next semester, is that on an educational plan, those are typically both for a period of 1 year. So they're often called goals, long-term goals and short-term benchmarks. So you don't get confusing, or just benchmarks. So you don't get confused by long-term versus short-term, because often they are both for a year. Don't get confused by that now. We'll cover that later. Part of the outcomes could, typically you're not going to write the results of an assessment in a goal, but you could be looking for performance, the ability to perform those statewide or national assessments. So as I said, goals are reviewed annually, and the team meets and then develop a new IEP.